To the shipping clerks and dock workers of the Moretti-Conti line, Isabella was a ghost, a nameless, drab translator they ignored for 3 years because she kept her eyes on her ledgers and her mouth shut. They mistook her silence for shame, never suspecting that the same mind now calculating freight taxes had once orchestrated the fall of 3 rival families in a single night across the Mediterranean. They sneered at the disgraced daughter, completely unaware she was the true Roman Dawn, holding the secret codes to an empire they were merely looting. The sneering would die the moment a fleet of armored black Ferraris would scream into the estate, carrying the old guard who had come to demand their queen back. The flickering yellow light of the shipping office in Trastevere hummed with that low, electric drone that usually preceded a storm. It was 6 p.m., the hour when the honest workers went home and the jackals of the underworld began to howl. Isabella Conti stood at a scarred wooden desk, meticulously translating a stack of Russian manifests. She was 30, though the sharp, weary lines around her green eyes and the way she pulled her dark hair back in a tight, punishing braid made her look like she had lived several lifetimes. She moved with a stiff, invisible grace, keeping her chin tucked, her shoulders rolled forward as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible in a room that used to be her father's. "Look at the princess," whispered Marco, a low-level enforcer, leaning against the doorframe with a mocking grin. He gestured with a cigarette toward Isabella. "I heard that when Luca kicked her out of the villa, she didn't even cry. Just took her father's ring and disappeared into the slums. How is she still on the payroll?" "She's a charity case." Marcello, a hot-headed lieutenant who wore his silk suits like a shield, laughed while checking his gold watch. "Luca keeps her around to remind everyone what happens to traitors. I asked her to translate the Sicilian shipment codes an hour ago, and she just stared at the page for 10 seconds like she'd forgotten her own name." 10 seconds. In this business, 10 seconds is a grave. Isabella heard them. She always heard them. Her ears had been tuned in marble halls where a whispered breath could signal a wiretap or a garrote. But she said nothing. She simply tightened her grip on her pen, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just quiet, she was aggressively invisible. She took the graveyard shifts without a word. She translated the boring ledgers the others ignored. She let men like Marcello berate her for mistakes she hadn't made. She had been exiled with the shamed reputation that the usurper, Luca Moretti, had carefully crafted to keep her from ever rising again. To everyone else, Isabella Conti was a broken relic who couldn't handle the weight of her own bloodline. "Conti." Marcello's voice cracked through the office like a gunshot. Isabella didn't flinch, but she went still. She turned slowly, the pale light of the office catching the amber flecks in her eyes. "Yes, sir. The Russian contract. The port fees are tripled. I told you to fix the wording 20 minutes ago. Why is the folder still closed?" Marcello was standing over her, using his broad frame to cast a shadow over her desk. I reviewed the terms, sir," Isabella said, her voice a low, raspy velvet, barely a whisper. "The Russians are using a Cyrillic dialect from the north. If I change the wording as you asked, it changes the ownership clause of the docks. I was waiting for Luca too." "You were waiting?" Marcello slammed his hand onto her desk, rattling the inkwell. The loud bang made the other clerks jump. Isabella didn't blink, but her pupils dilated into sharp points. "You don't wait to think, Conti. You do what you're told. You are a translator. I am a made man. If I say change the contract, you change the contract. Do I need to tell Luca you're being difficult again?" "No, sir," Isabella said, lowering her eyes to his polished, imitation leather shoes. "I'll do it." She walked toward the filing room, feeling the heat of their mocking stares burning into her spine. "Pathetic," Marco muttered as she vanished into the shadows. "She's a Conti in name only." the blood went thin. Isabella leaned against the cold stone wall of the archives, her breathing shallow. She closed her eyes. For a split second, the smell of dust and cheap tobacco vanished, replaced by the scent of expensive ozone, vintage wine, and the iron tang of Marcello's blood. She saw her father's face, pale in his casket, and felt the weight of the signet ring she kept hidden in a silk pouch against her skin. "Stay patient, Isabella," she told herself. "Let them believe you are the mouse. The trap is already set." But the silence was about to be broken. The black Audi pulled up to the curb of the Conti estate, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like breaking bone. Isabella sat in the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look at the guards who flanked the massive iron gates, men who had once called her Principessa and now looked through her as if she were a smudge on the glass. Stepping out, the Roman humidity clung to her skin, heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive gasoline. The villa loomed over her, a masterpiece of marble and history that had belonged to her bloodline for 4 generations. Now, the Conti crest above the door looked tarnished, or perhaps it was just the new, gaudy security cameras Luca had installed, digital eyes that lacked the soul of the men they replaced. She was led not to the formal parlor, but to the grand library. As the double doors swung open, the smell of old paper and tobacco hit her. And there he was. Luca Moretti sat behind the desk of Don Marcello. It was a massive slab of dark oak that Isabella used to hide under as a child while her father discussed the fate of nations. Luca looked comfortable, too comfortable. He was swirling a glass of amber liquid, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, his tailored suit screaming of a wealth he hadn't earned, but stolen. "Isabella," Luca said, his voice a smooth, treacherous silk. He didn't stand. He didn't even look up from the ledger he was reading. "You're late. I suppose the bus system in Trastevere is as unreliable as your father's old heart." Isabella remained by the door, her head slightly bowed, the mouse persona firmly in place. "I apologize, Luca. There was a delay at the shipping office." "Don't call me Luca," he snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, sharp flints of ambition. "In this house, I am the center of gravity. You will address me as you would have addressed Marcello." The air in the room curdled. Isabella felt the phantom weight of her father's presence in the corners of the room, watching the usurper soil his chair. She tightened her grip on her cheap handbag. "Yes, Don Luca." A crooked, satisfied smile touched his lips. He gestured to a silver tray on the corner of the desk, piled high with disorganized, handwritten notes and stained receipts. "The Russians are complaining about the inventory logs from the last 3 years. Apparently, your father's record-keeping was as sentimental as his politics. Sort them. Translate the footnotes. I want a clean digital file by dawn." It was a task for a clerk, a deliberate insult designed to keep her hands busy and her spirit low. Isabella walked forward, her footsteps silent on the Persian rug. As she reached for the tray, Luca leaned forward, the smell of his expensive cologne overwhelming her. "Do you know why I keep you around, Isabella?" he whispered, his eyes scanning her pale face for a flicker of the old fire. "Because seeing the true heir of Rome organizing my trash reminds me that the world belongs to the clever, not the entitled. Now, get to work. And use the small stool in the corner. I don't want you getting too comfortable in my library." Isabella took the tray and moved to the shadows. She sat on the hard wooden stool, her back straight, her expression vacant. Luca thought he was humiliating her. He didn't realize that from this corner, she could see every entry in the ledger he thought he'd hidden. She began to write, her pen moving with a lethal, silent precision. Luca had invited the ghost into his sanctuary, never realizing that ghosts see everything. The moon hung low and bloated over the arches of the Colosseum, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ancient stones. It was past midnight, and the tourists had long since retreated to their hotels, leaving the ruins to the stray cats and the memories of slaughtered kings. Isabella walked through the darkness of the Via Sacra, her silhouette a sharp, dark line against the pale travertine. She had shed the drab cardigan of the office for a tailored black coat, the collar turned up against the damp Roman chill. She stopped near a crumbling buttress where the shadows were deepest. For several minutes, she stood perfectly still, listening. She didn't listen for footsteps, she listened for the absence of sound, the way the local birds went silent when someone was lurking. Only when she heard the rhythmic, metallic click of a lighter did she move. "You're being followed, little bird," a gravelly voice rasped from the gloom. Enzo Ricci stepped into the faint amber glow of the street lamp. He looked like a man carved from the Appian Way, lined, weathered, and unyielding. His gray hair was cropped short, and his hands, thick with the scars of a 40-year career as her father's enforcer, were shoved deep into the pockets of an old leather jacket. "Luca's men are lazy, Enzo," Isabella replied, her voice no longer a raspy whisper, but a cold, melodic bell. "They stopped at the tavern 3 blocks back. They think I'm crying over my father's ledger. They don't think I'm worth the walk in the cold." Enzo studied her, his wary eyes softening with a flicker of pride. "The mouse plays her part well. Too well. The streets are whispering, Isabella. They say the Conti line is dead. They say Luca is selling the northern ports to the Russians next week at the Centennial Gala. If that ink dries, the family is gone forever." Isabella stepped closer, her green eyes flashing like flint in the dark. "The ink won't dry. I've seen the ledgers, Enzo. Luca is overleveraged. He's skimming from the syndicate to pay for his vanity, and the Russians don't know he's selling them a hollowed-out shell. He's desperate." Enzo leaned against the cold stone, his expression grim. "Desperate men are the most dangerous. I have 40 men left, the old guard. They're tired, Isabella. They're hiding in basements and working as bouncers. They need a reason to bleed. They need to know that the girl I used to teach to strip a beretta is still in there." Isabella reached into the hidden pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small, velvet pouch and emptied it into her palm. A heavy gold ring, etched with the image of a roaring lion and a crown of thorns, shimmered in the moonlight. "The Conti signet. Tell them the dawn is already in the house," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "Tell them to sharpen their blades and wait for the signal. When the lights go out at the gala, they don't strike for the family. They strike for me." Enzo looked at the ring, then at the woman standing before him. He didn't see a disgraced exile. He saw the true Roman dawn. He bowed his head, a sharp, military nod of total fealty. "The ghosts will be ready, Valkyrie." The rain began as a fine mist and transitioned into a relentless Roman downpour, slicking the terracotta tiles of the rooftops overlooking the Piazza Navona. Isabella moved across the heights with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her youth scaling these very gargoyles. She was mere minutes away from her sanctuary when a shadow detached itself from a chimney stack, blocking her path. "You always did prefer the high road, Bella. Even when the fall is certain." Isabella stopped, her boots finding purchase on the whetstone. She didn't reach for a weapon. She knew that voice as well as her own heartbeat. Matteo Rossi stood 5 paces away, his dark hair tousled and plastered to his forehead by the rain. He wore a fitted leather jacket that showed the lean, dangerous strength of a man who lived between worlds. As a captain in a rival faction, he was technically her enemy. As the boy who had stolen her first kiss in the Conti Gardens, he was something far more complicated. "Matteo," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden spike in her pulse. "You're off your territory. Luca doesn't like strays on his rooftops. Luca doesn't know what he likes, Matteo countered, stepping into the dim light of a distant street lamp. His brown eyes were expressive, burning with a mix of frustration and a warmth he couldn't quite mask. He's a scavenger wearing a dead man's skin. But you? You're playing a game that ends in a shallow grave outside the city walls. I have orders to bring you in, Isabella. The syndicate thinks you're a liability. He moved closer, his presence drawing the air out of the space between them. Isabella felt the familiar tension, the magnetic pull of a man who had been her confidant before he became her rival. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the collar of her coat, sensing the steel beneath her shamed exterior. "Is it worth it?" he whispered, his voice dropping to a rugged, intimate rasp. "Reclaiming a throne that's already burnt to ash? You could leave. Tonight. I can get you past the Coast Guard. We could be in Marseille by dawn." Isabella looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the true dawn wavered. She saw the life he was offering, a life without shadows, without the scent of gunpowder and ancient blood. But then she felt the cold weight of her father's signet ring through the fabric of her pocket. "You think I'm here for the throne, Matteo?" she asked, stepping into his personal space until her chest nearly brushed his. She looked up, her green eyes piercing through the rain. "I'm here for the legacy. Luca didn't just take my house, he took my honor. And in Rome, honor is the only thing that outlives the stone." Matteo's hand tightened on her shoulder, not to restrain her, but as if he were trying to anchor himself. The conflict in his eyes was clear. He was a double agent of the heart, caught between his duty to his faction and his devotion to the woman who should have been his queen. "Then I'll give you a head start," he said, leaning in until his breath warmed her ear. "But if you show up at that gala, Isabella, I won't be able to protect you. The Russians aren't as sentimental as I am." "I don't need protection, Matteo," she whispered back, her hand momentarily grazing the leather of his jacket. "I need you to stay out of the crossfire." She vanished into the dark before he could respond, leaving him alone on the rain-swept roof. The air in the private cigar lounge of the Villa Borghese was thick enough to choke a saint. Luca sat across from Viktor Volkov, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of a frozen Siberian lake. Between them sat a map of the Tyrrhenian coast and a contract that represented the total liquidation of the Conti heritage. Isabella stood at the edge of the mahogany table, her hands clasped in front of her, the perfect picture of a subservient tool. "Tell him," Luca commanded, exhaling a plume of blue smoke that drifted toward Isabella like a shroud. "Tell him the Port Authority is already in my pocket. Tell him the security fee he's paying covers the safe passage of his entire autumn fleet. No inspections. No delays." Isabella looked at the Russian. Volkov didn't trust Luca. She could see it in the way the man's pulse hammered at the base of his neck. He was looking for a reason to bolt. She looked down at the Cyrillic text on the page, her mind moving 10 steps ahead of the men in the room. "Mr. Volkov," Isabella began, her voice a soft, melodic hum that filled the room. In Russian, she spoke with a dialect so precise it made Volkov lean in, his eyes narrowing. But she didn't say what Luca had ordered. "The Dawn wishes you to know," she translated, her tone steady while her heart raced with cold fire, "that the security fee is actually a tribute to the Moretti family personally. He admits that the local authorities are restless and that he cannot guarantee the docks past the end of the month. He suggests you pay the tripled rate now, or he will offer the same passage to the Bulgarians by morning." Volkov froze. He slammed his hand on the table, the heavy gold of his rings cracking against the wood. He unleashed a torrent of guttural Russian, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "What did he say?" Luca snapped, sitting upright, his arrogance momentarily replaced by a flicker of panicked confusion. "Why is he angry?" "I gave him everything he wanted." Isabella turned to Luca, her expression a mask of wide-eyed, helpless concern. The mouse was back, trembling just enough to sell the lie. He says he is offended by your generosity, Don Luca. He thinks the price is so low it must be a trap. He is suspicious because you are being too kind. He says if you don't raise the stakes to show your power, he will think you are weak. Weak. Luca's ego flared like a doused flame. He looked at Volkov, who was now standing and shouting at his own bodyguards. Tell him the price is tripled. Tell him if he wants the Conti docks, he pays for the privilege of standing in my shadow. Isabella turned back to Volkov. She didn't translate the tripled price. Instead, she whispered in Russian, he says he owns you now, Volkov. He says your fleet belongs to Rome, and if you leave this room without signing, your ships will never leave the harbor. The room erupted. Volkov lunged toward Luca, held back only by the sheer mass of his guards. Luca stood his ground, shouting orders he didn't realize were his own death warrant. In the center of the storm stood Isabella, her eyes downcast, her lips curved into the ghost of a smile. She had poisoned the well. Now she just had to wait for them to drink. The Centennial Gala was a display of obscene, stolen wealth, held in the grand ballroom of the Conti estate under chandeliers that dripped with enough crystal to buy a small city. The air was a suffocating blend of expensive perfume and the metallic tang of hidden weapons. Luca Moretti stood at the center of the room, a king on a borrowed throne, but his eyes were restless. The chaos with the Russians had left him paranoid, his ego bruised by the sudden friction he couldn't quite explain. Isabella moved through the crowd not as a guest, but as a servant. Luca had stripped her of her tailored black coat, forcing her into a thin, sleeveless uniform that offered no protection against the drafty halls or the biting stares of the elite. Her task was simple: carry a silver tray of vintage Krug and serve the very men who had spit on her father's grave. More wine, Conti, Marcello barked, snapping his fingers. He was surrounded by a cluster of captains who had switched their allegiances the moment the wind changed. As Isabella approached, her head bowed, Marcello deliberately tipped his glass, spilling the dark red liquid down the front of her uniform. The ballroom went quiet as the stain spread over her chest like a fresh wound. Marcello laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. Look at that. The true heir covered in the dregs. Just like her father's legacy. Luca stepped forward, the crowd parting for him. He didn't look angry. He looked predatory. He reached out and gripped Isabella's chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. The mouse trembled, her breath hitching in a way that made Luca's smile broaden. You seem distracted, Isabella, Luca purred, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Perhaps you're still thinking about your father. Or perhaps you're wondering why the Russians are so agitated tonight. You wouldn't be keeping secrets from me, would you? No, Don Luca, she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. I am only a translator. You are a ghost, Luca spat, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. And tonight, I'm going to make sure everyone remembers why ghosts belong in the dirt. Since you love serving so much, you will spend the rest of the evening on your knees, clearing the debris from the floor. Start with the glass Marcello just dropped. He shoved her back, and Isabella collapsed to the marble floor, the silver tray clattering beside her. A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the room. As she reached for a shard of glass, she felt a shadow fall over her. It was Matteo. He stood among the rival captains, his face a mask of iron, but his hand was white-knuckled on his glass. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a silent plea from him to run, and a cold, lethal promise from her to stay. Isabella lowered her gaze, her fingers closing around a sharp sliver of crystal. She didn't feel the sting of the glass cutting her palm. She only felt the rhythmic pulse of the clock. It was 11:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, the red move would begin. The humiliation wasn't a defeat, it was the final height of the mountain before the avalanche. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, the heavy chime echoing through the ballroom like a funeral bell. At the final stroke, the world died. The massive crystal chandeliers flickered once and plunged the room into a terrifying, absolute darkness. A collective gasp of the elite was followed by the frantic scraping of chairs and the metallic slide of handguns being drawn in the blind. Security. Lights. Luca's voice screamed from the center of the hall, stripped of its aristocratic polish and replaced by a jagged, high-pitched panic. But the only answer was the sound of the world outside. From the gardens, a low, mechanical growl began to vibrate the floorboards, the synchronized roar of high-performance engines. Then came the lights. Not the warm glow of the estate, but the blinding, surgical white of tactical spotlights cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The beams swept across the ballroom, illuminating the swirling dust and the terrified faces of the usurpers like deer in a hunter's sights. Suddenly, the grand glass doors leading to the terrace didn't just open, they shattered. Figures emerged from the white glare, moving with a predatory, silent synchronization that made the syndicate's hired guns look like amateurs. These were not Luca's men. They wore the dark, traditional charcoal suits of the Conti Old Guard, but their faces were shielded by black tactical masks. They moved like shadows given form, the ghosts that Enzo had promised. The sound of suppressed gunfire, thud, 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 was almost polite. Luca's personal security team dropped before they could even find their targets, their bodies hitting the marble with a dull finality. The guests screamed, diving under tables as the smell of ozone and gunpowder replaced the scent of expensive champagne. "Stay where you are." Enzo's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the hall. He stepped through the wreckage of the glass doors, a submachine gun held low at his hip. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the woman still kneeling in the center of the floor. Isabella stood up slowly. She didn't brush the glass from her knees or wipe the spilled wine from her chest. In the strobe-like flashes of the tactical lights, she looked like a vengeful spirit rising from a battlefield. The mouse was gone. The hunched shoulders had straightened into a statuesque, commanding line. Matteo moved instinctively toward her, his own weapon drawn, his body positioned as a shield between Isabella and the Russian guards who were scrambling for cover. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of terror and dawning awe. He had known she was dangerous, but he had never seen the true dawn unleashed. Luca backed away, stumbling over the very chair he had used to humiliate her moments before. "Enzo? What is this?" "I'll double whatever she's paying you. I'll triple it." Enzo didn't even blink. He stepped aside, clearing a path between the old guard and the woman in the stained uniform. "You can't buy what you betrayed, Luca," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the cold authority of a blade. She reached into her damp bodice and pulled out the gold signet ring. She slid it onto her finger, the heavy gold clicking against her skin. The ghosts didn't look at Enzo. They didn't look at the Russians. As one, 40 men turned toward Isabella and bowed their heads. The hunt was over. The reign had begun. Isabella stepped into the center of the spotlight, the shattered glass beneath her feet sounding like the snapping of Luca's pride. The tactical lights from the garden focused on her, turning the wine-stained front of her uniform into a deep, regal crimson. She no longer looked like a servant covered in dregs. She looked like a queen who had waded through blood to reach her throne. "The red move," Enzo whispered from the perimeter, a grim smile touching his lips. It was the signal the old guard had waited 3 years to see, the moment the Conti heir stopped hiding and started ruling. Luca was hyperventilating, his back pressed against the mahogany desk that had once belonged to a better man. This is a coup. Matteo, do something. Kill her. He pointed a shaking finger at Isabella, looking to his captains for a loyalty that had already evaporated in the heat of the spotlights. Matteo didn't move toward Isabella to strike. Instead, he stepped into the light beside her, his weapon transitioned to a low-ready position, aimed squarely at Luca's chest. The double agent had finally chosen his side. "The orders have changed, Luca," Matteo said, his voice a rugged, unforgiving rasp. "The Rossi family doesn't back losers. And tonight, you look very small." Isabella walked toward Luca, her pace slow and deliberate. With every step, she reclaimed a piece of the room. The Russian syndicate members, sensing the shift in the wind, lowered their weapons and stepped back into the shadows. They were businessmen, and they could see that the CEO of Rome had just entered the building. "You called me a ghost, Luca," Isabella said, stopping inches from him. The Mao's voice was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical steel that made the air in the room feel thin. "You said ghosts belong in the dirt. But you forgot that a ghost sees everything. I saw the offshore accounts you opened in Zurich. I saw the way you skimmed from Volkov shipments. And I saw the look in my father's eyes when you slipped the digitalis into his nightly brandy." The room went deathly silent. The accusation hung in the air like a noose. Luca's face turned a sickly, translucent gray. You have no proof. You were in exile." Isabella reached into the pocket of her stained uniform and pulled out a small, high-capacity data drive, the one she had quietly compiled while organizing his trash in the library. She held it up between two fingers. "This isn't just proof of murder, Luca. It's the ledger of every lie you've told the syndicate. By dawn, every family from here to Moscow will know you've been stealing from them." She leaned in closer, her green eyes burning with a terrifying, calm intensity. "I'm not going to kill you, Luca. That would be too quick. I'm going to strip you of the Moretti name. I'm going to take your villas, your cars, and your dignity. You will leave this house exactly how you tried to make me leave, with nothing but the shame you earned." She turned her back on him, the ultimate insult, and looked at the gathered captains of Rome. "The Conti line is not dead," she announced, her voice echoing off the marble. "It has simply been refined." One by one, the captains who had laughed at her 3 hours ago lowered their heads. The transition was absolute. Desperation is a slow-acting poison, but for Luca Moretti, it reached the heart in a sudden, violent surge. As Isabella turned her back, a gesture of supreme indifference that cut deeper than any blade, Luca's hand dived into the hidden holster beneath the mahogany desk. His face was a distorted mask of sweat and ruined pride. He was no longer a consigliere or a don. He was a cornered animal realizing the trap had been shut for years. "If I go to the dirt, Isabella, I'm taking the crown with me," he shrieked, his voice breaking as he leveled the compact Beretta at the center of her spine. The room froze, but Isabella didn't flinch. She didn't even break her stride. The crack of a gunshot echoed through the ballroom, shattering a decorative urn near the balcony, but it didn't come from Luca's weapon. Before his finger could squeeze the trigger, a heavy tactical boot slammed into the side of the desk, pinning Luca's arm against the wood. It was Enzo, moving with the terrifying speed of a man half his age. Simultaneously, the cold muzzle of a suppressed rifle pressed against Luca's temple. Isabella stopped and turned slowly, her expression as calm as a frozen lake. She looked down at Luca, who was pinned to the desk, his arm twisted at a sickening angle. The Beretta clattered to the floor, sliding across the marble until it bumped against the toe of Isabella's stained shoe. "You always were predictable, Luca," she said softly, her voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. "You think power comes from the gun in your hand. My father taught me that true power comes from the hand that holds the gun." She looked at the men surrounding him, his own personal security detail. They weren't moving to help him. They stood like statues, their eyes fixed on Isabella. "Marcello," she called out, looking toward the man who had spilled wine on her earlier. The hot-headed lieutenant looked like he wanted to vanish. "You have 2 minutes to decide if you want to spend the rest of your life running from the Russians, or if you want to prove your worth to the new administration. Take Mr. Moretti to the basement. Ensure he stays alive long enough to sign the transfer papers for the Zurich accounts." Marcello didn't hesitate. The lure of survival was stronger than any fleeting loyalty to a falling star. He stepped forward, grabbing Luca by the collar and dragging him away from the desk. Luca's screams for mercy echoed down the hall, becoming fainter and more pathetic with every second until they were silenced by the heavy thud of the cellar doors. Isabella walked to her father's chair. She didn't sit in it, not yet. She ran her hand over the dark, polished oak, feeling the history etched into the grain. She looked at Matteo, who remained at the edge of the light, his gaze never leaving her. The tension between them was no longer about betrayal. It was about the heavy, silent recognition of what she had become. The mouse was buried beneath the marble of the Conti estate. In her place stood a woman who had used her exile to build a fortress of secrets and her shame to sharpen a sword. Rome was quiet now, waiting for its first command. The first rays of a bruised Roman dawn began to bleed over the horizon, tinting the city's terracotta skyline in hues of violet and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and smelling of wet stone and ancient earth. Isabella stepped out onto the grand balcony of the Conti estate, the heavy glass doors clicking shut behind her. She had finally shed the stained servant's uniform, replacing it with a tailored suit of ivory silk that caught the morning light. On her right hand, the Conti signet ring felt heavy, a grounding weight that signaled the end of her wandering. Below, in the courtyard, the black Ferraris were idling, their engines a low, rhythmic thrum that sounded like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The old guards stood at attention, their shadows long and sharp against the cobblestones. They were no longer ghosts, they were the pillars of a restored empire. A soft footfall sounded on the stone behind her. Isabella didn't need to turn to know it was Matteo. He came to stand beside her, leaning his elbows on the marble balustrade. He looked exhausted, his leather jacket darkened by rain and grime, but the tension that had defined his posture for years had finally begun to ease. "The city looks different from up here," Matteo said, his voice a low, thoughtful rasp. "Quieter. As if it doesn't know it changed hands overnight." "Rome always knows," Isabella replied, her green eyes scanning the distant dome of St. Peter's. "It just waits to see if the new hand is strong enough to hold the reins." Matteo turned to her, his gaze intense and uncharacteristically vulnerable. "And are you? You've reclaimed the name, Isabella. You've broken Luca. But the syndicate won't just let you sit on this throne in peace. They'll come for a piece of the harvest." Isabella turned to face him, the cool morning breeze whipping a stray lock of dark hair across her cheek. She didn't look like the woman who had scrubbed floors or translated dry manifests. She looked like the architect of a new world order. "Let them come. I didn't spend 3 years in the shadows just to defend a wall, Matteo. I spent them learning where the walls are thin. The Conti family isn't going back to the old ways. We aren't scavengers anymore. We are the masters of the flow." Matteo reached out, his hand hesitating before he gently tucked the stray hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold gold of the ring on her finger. "And where does that leave a stray like me? Still a rival? Or something else?" Isabella stepped closer, the distance between them evaporating in the quiet of the dawn. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady, rapid thrum of his heart. "Rome wasn't built by one person, Matteo. It was built by those brave enough to stay when the fire started. You stayed." She looked out over her city, her chin lifted in a silent challenge to the horizon. The exile was over. The shame had been burned away. The true Roman dawn had returned, and for the first time in 3 years, Isabella Conti wasn't looking for a place to hide. She was looking at everything she intended to own.